Have you ever found yourself caught in a web of desperation and fear, where the decisions you make could either save your loved ones or destroy them? In this gripping tale of betrayal, sacrifice, and redemption, we follow the heart-wrenching journey of Ramon and Lucia, a father and daughter whose lives are forever changed by a fateful decision. From a moment of treachery that sold a daughter's future for mere survival, to a powerful transformation forged in the fires of adversity, this story takes us from hope to despair and back to hope again. Prepare to be moved by the strength of the human spirit as we explore the lengths one father will go to protect his family and the incredible resilience of a daughter determined to reclaim her life. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. In a desperate act of betrayal, a father with no scruples bartered his daughter's future for a mere $1,000, handing her over to a ruthless drug lord. 2 months later, terror consumed him as his legs buckled under the weight of fear when two men, with icy determination, ordered him into a black van. On a suffocating summer night, Ramon Suarez stood motionless in the doorway of his daughter Lucia's cramped, dilapidated room. The pale glow of the moon seeped through the cracked window, casting a soft light over the peaceful face of his 18-year-old daughter, who slept soundly, oblivious to the catastrophe looming on the horizon. At 45, Ramon was a man worn down by relentless toil and the crushing burdens of life, each hardship etching itself into his weary soul. His tired eyes swept over the room's crumbling walls and sagging ceiling, the physical embodiment of the poverty and despair that had become his existence. Every corner of that house was a testament to the hardships they had endured, a silent cry of hopelessness that echoed in his mind. As he closed his eyes, memories crashed over him like a relentless tide. He saw Elena, his wife, tears streaming down her face as she painstakingly counted out the coins needed to buy medicine. The chilling recollection of loan sharks, their fists bloodied from banging on their door in the dead of night, replayed in his mind. And then, the unbearable image of his youngest son, Pedro, burning with fever, his small body trembling, and Ramon's helplessness as he was unable to take him to the hospital. The shrill, piercing ring of his cell phone jolted him back to the present, his heart pounding in his chest. With trembling fingers, he fished the battered phone from his pocket, his dread growing as he pressed it to his ear. The voice on the other end was like ice, cold and unyielding. "You have 24 hours, Suarez. Pay up, or your family pays in blood." The line went dead, leaving Ramon in a void of silence so profound it was almost suffocating. His gaze drifted back to Lucia, and a stabbing pain seared through his heart. How had it come to this? How could he possibly shield his family from the storm that was about to break? Dragging his feet as if they were made of lead, Ramon moved toward the kitchen. There, buried beneath a pile of unpaid bills and eviction notices, he unearthed a crumpled business card. The words "Quick Solutions for Tough Problems" gleamed mockingly in golden print. Ramon had kept it for weeks, dreading the day when despair would force his hand. That day had now arrived. His heart thundered in his chest as he dialed the number. After what seemed like an eternity, a deep voice answered. "I have an offer for you, Suarez, but it will cost you dearly." Ramon's eyes darted once more toward Lucia's room. "I'll do anything," he murmured, sealing not just his fate, but that of his entire family. The restaurant La Rosa Dorada glittered like a beacon of luxury in the heart of the city, a stark contrast to the life Ramon knew. His tattered shirt and scuffed shoes marked him as an outsider, a man out of place in such opulence. Seated across from him was the Jaguar, a man in his 50s, dressed impeccably, his smile predatory. He watched Ramon with a gaze that was both amused and calculating, like a cat toying with its prey before the kill. $1,000, Suarez the Jaguar said, sliding a manila envelope across the gleaming mahogany table. "For your daughter Lucia. It's a fair exchange, wouldn't you agree?" The breath left Ramon's lungs as if he had been punched. His hands shook as he opened the envelope, revealing stacks of cash far beyond anything he had ever seen. For a fleeting moment, he envisioned a future free of debt, his family safe from harm. But the image of Lucia, his innocent little girl, pierced through his thoughts like a dagger, twisting his insides with guilt and revulsion. "No, I can't," Ramon stuttered, pushing the envelope away. "She's my daughter, for God's sake." The jaguar's smile remained, but a cold hardness crept into his eyes. With an almost casual movement, he pulled out his phone and wordlessly showed Ramon a series of photographs: Alina leaving the supermarket, Pedro playing in the park, and Lucia standing at the school gate. "Your family is under my watch," Suarez the jaguar murmured, his voice deceptively soft yet dripping with menace. "Accept the deal, and your debt disappears. Your family lives refuse." Ramon's thoughts whirled, a storm of guilt, terror, and despair threatening to consume him. The jaguar, sensing his weakening resolve, produced a thick wad of bills and slid it closer. "An advance," he said, his tone almost soothing, "so you know I mean business." Ramon's hands trembled as he reached for the money, each bill feeling heavier than the last, like a weight pressing down on his soul. He looked into the jaguar's eyes and, in that instant, knew that he had condemned himself. "I accept," Ramon whispered, the words burning like acid in his throat. The jaguar's satisfaction was palpable as he leaned back, a pleased smile playing on his lips. "Welcome to the business, Suarez. Your daughter belongs to me now." The atmosphere inside the modest Suarez home was suffocating, thick with tension that felt as if it could snap at any moment. Lucia, her deep brown eyes narrowed in suspicion, watched her father as he nervously paced the small living room. There was something different about him lately, something unsettling that she couldn't quite put her finger on, and it gnawed at her insides like a relentless parasite. Determined to uncover the truth, Lucia's voice cut through the heavy silence, firm but tinged with the fear that had taken root in her heart. "What's happening, Dad?" she demanded, her tone unyielding. "You've been acting so strange. What are you keeping from me?" Ramon, his hands trembling slightly, avoided her probing gaze. He fumbled with the scattered papers on the table, his voice weak and evasive. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Just problems that adults have to deal with." But Lucia was far from convinced. The unease in her father's eyes told her that whatever he was hiding was something far more sinister than mere adult troubles. Driven by a growing sense of dread, Lucia turned on her heel and headed to her parents' room, her heart pounding in her chest. She began searching, her fingers sifting through the hidden spaces, until they brushed against something solid, a concealed envelope under the mattress. Her breath caught in her throat as she pulled it out, her mind racing with possibilities. Lucia, Ramon's voice boomed as he rushed into the room, panic etched across his face. But it was too late. Lucia had already torn open the envelope, her eyes widening in shock as she stared at the wad of cash inside. Her voice trembled with a mix of confusion and fear as she looked up at her father. "Where did this money come from, Dad? What did you do?" Ramon's resolve crumbled like a sandcastle in the wind, and the truth spilled out of him in a torrent of guilt and despair. He confessed everything: the deal he had made with the jaguar, the sinister pact that had brought them to this moment. As the words poured out, Lucia's world began to disintegrate before her eyes. "You sold me," she screamed, her voice choked with tears of fury and heartbreak. "How could you, your daughter?" "I had no choice," Ramon pleaded desperately, his voice breaking. "They were going to kill us all," but his justification only fueled the fire of Lucia's rage. The argument escalated into a full-blown confrontation, years of unspoken resentment and sacrifice boiling to the surface like a volcano finally erupting. Lucia tried to escape the nightmare unfolding before her, but Ramon grabbed her arm, desperation driving his actions. "Let me go," Lucia cried, struggling against her father's grip. In the chaos, she lost her balance and fell, her head striking the edge of the table with a sickening thud. A thin line of blood trickled from the wound, staining the floor. The sight of his daughter injured and vulnerable, a consequence of his actions, sent a wave of horror crashing over Ramon. With trembling hands, he pulled out his phone, his mind numb with the gravity of what he had done. "It's done," he said into the phone, his voice hollow. "I accept the deal." Outside, the roar of a powerful engine shattered the night stillness. A sleek, ominous black van pulled up in front of the Suarez house, its presence like a harbinger of doom. The Jaguar emerged with the grace of a predator, flanked by two menacing figures. Ramon opened the door, his face a mask of anguish and resignation. Lucia, semi-conscious on the sofa, with a hastily applied bandage on her head, was too weak to resist. "I see you've made things easier," Suarez the Jaguar observed coldly, his gaze sweeping over the scene with a detached amusement. The neighbors, drawn to their windows and doors by the commotion, watched in fearful silence, too terrified to intervene. The air was thick with the drug lord's power, an oppressive force that kept everyone in check. With a slight nod, the Jaguar signaled his men to take Lucia. Ramon stood frozen, helpless, as they lifted his daughter and carried her out to the waiting van. He wanted to scream, to stop them, but the fear that had gripped his heart rendered him immobile. "Here's your payment," the Jaguar said, handing Ramon a heavy briefcase. $1,000, as we agreed. Ramon accepted the briefcase, its weight feeling unbearable in his hands. Each bill inside was a painful reminder of the price he had paid, the ultimate betrayal he had committed. "Remember this," Suarez the Jaguar warned, his voice low and menacing. "She belongs to me now. If you speak a word or try anything foolish, your family will suffer the consequences." The van's engine roared back to life, its sound fading into the night as it drove away with Lucia inside. Ramon stood in the middle of the street, clutching the briefcase, the price of his daughter's life. The eyes of the neighbors burned into him, their gazes a mix of pity, disgust, and fear. In the distance, the wail of police sirens echoed, oblivious to the tragedy that had just unfolded. Ramon looked down at his hands, stained with both Lucia's blood and the Jaguar's dirty money. The weight of his decision crushed him, and he collapsed to his knees on the cold pavement. The sirens grew louder, but for Ramon, the world had already ended. He realized, in that moment of utter despair, that he had lost something far greater than his daughter. He had lost his soul. 2 agonizing months had crawled by, but for Ramon Suarez, every moment felt like an eternity in a personal hell. The money he had received in exchange for his daughter had cleared the debts that once threatened to destroy his family, but the emotional toll was far more than he could bear. The house, which had once been a sanctuary, now stood as a suffocating prison, trapping him within walls steeped in guilt and remorse. Ramon had become a mere ghost of the man he used to be, his once bright eyes now hollow and sunken, surrounded by dark shadows that bore witness to endless sleepless nights. The bottle had become his constant companion, a pitiful attempt to drown the screams of his conscience that echoed relentlessly in his mind. Elena, his wife, looked at him every day with a gaze that was a potent mixture of contempt and deep-seated pain. "Where's my daughter, Ramon?" she would demand, her voice laden with accusation. "What did you do to our Lucia?" But Ramon had no answers to give, only silence and another swig of alcohol to numb the relentless torment. His nights were haunted by nightmares, vivid and cruel, where Lucia's voice echoed in his ears, pleading for help, as he turned his back on her with blood-stained hands clutching dirty money. One fateful night, drowning in despair and completely inebriated, Ramon made a decision. He stumbled out into the cold, unforgiving street, his only thought to go to the police and confess everything. Perhaps, in doing so, he could save Lucia and find some shred of redemption for the monstrous act he had committed. But as he staggered through the dark, winding streets, his mind muddled by alcohol and guilt, he failed to notice the ominous black van trailing him. It wasn't until the vehicle came to a sudden stop beside him that Ramon's dulled senses snapped to attention, realizing that his past had finally caught up with him. 2 large men emerged from the van, their faces as hard and unyielding as stone. Ramon recognized them immediately, the same men who had taken Lucia from him on that nightmarish evening. "The Jaguar wants to see you," one of them stated, his voice cold and sharp as a blade. Ramon's heart faltered, skipping a beat as dread settled like a lead weight in his stomach. He had known that this moment would come, but no amount of anticipation had prepared him for the terror that now gripped him. As they shoved him into the back of the van, a single, desperate thought flashed through his mind. Was this his final punishment? Or, by some miracle, could this be a chance for redemption? The van wound its way through the city, navigating a labyrinth of twists and turns that left Ramon completely disoriented. Inside the vehicle, an eerie silence reigned, broken only by the occasional creak of the leather seats and Ramon's ragged, uneven breathing. The two men who flanked him remained stone-faced, their eyes hidden behind dark glasses, even in the dead of night, their presence a chilling reminder of the cold, calculated world they inhabited. Ramon could feel the weight of their silent judgment, their gazes piercing through him, assessing his every move with an unnerving calm. As the van rolled on, Ramon's mind spiraled into a maelstrom of dark thoughts. He pictured his death with vivid clarity, his body discarded like trash in a forgotten alley, never to be found. He thought of Elena, the pain in her eyes, and how she would never know what had become of him or Lucia. Regret clawed at him, suffocating him with the crushing weight of missed opportunities and the endless what-ifs that swirled through his tortured mind. After what felt like an eternity, the van finally stopped in front of an imposing mansion that loomed large in the darkness. Ramon blinked in confusion. This was not the grim fate he had expected. The men led him inside, their footsteps echoing ominously on the polished marble floors. What Ramon saw next made his breath catch in his throat. The walls, framed in gold, were adorned with photographs of Lucia. But the girl in these pictures was unrecognizable. This Lucia was poised, elegant, exuding a power that both shocked and unsettled him. Her gaze in the photos was sharp, filled with a cold determination that sent a chill down Ramon's spine. In one of the images, she stood beside the Jaguar, both smiling in the company of a group of men who looked like they belonged to the upper echelons of power. What does this mean?" Ramon murmured, his voice barely audible, trembling with confusion and fear. No one answered his question. The men guided him through a series of grand hallways until they reached a heavy oak door, intricately carved and imposing. One of them pushed it open, nudging Ramon inside. There, behind a massive desk that dominated the room, sat Lucia. The sight of her, so changed, so commanding, made Ramon feel as though the ground had vanished beneath his feet. "Hello, Dad," Lucia greeted him, her voice as icy as the depths of winter. "Welcome to my world." The silence in the opulent office was stifling, thick enough to choke on. Ramon stood rooted to the spot, his mouth dry, his heart hammering in his chest as he stared at his daughter, barely able to recognize her. Lucia rose from her seat with a slow, deliberate grace. The designer suit she wore accentuated a figure that was no longer the girl he had raised, but a woman who had come into her own, a woman who now held the power that Ramon had so disastrously surrendered. Her eyes, once bright with warmth and innocence, now glinted with a hard, unyielding resolve that made Ramon's blood run cold. You've changed," Ramon stammered, his voice barely more than a whisper, laden with a mix of awe and terror. Lucia's gaze never wavered, the coldness in her eyes a stark contrast to the tearful young woman who had once looked up to him for guidance. At that moment, Ramon knew that the daughter he had once known was gone, replaced by someone forged in the fires of betrayal and survival. And as the reality of his actions settled in, Ramon realized that he had not only lost his daughter, he had created something he could no longer control. A cold, almost cruel smile curled on Lucia's lips as she spoke, her voice dripping with bitterness. "People change when they're sold like cattle. Dad, each word was like a dagger plunging into Ramon's heart, the pain of his guilt and regret intensifying with every syllable. He took a hesitant step towards her, his hands trembling, but Lucia swiftly raised a hand, halting him in his tracks. "Don't fool yourself," she said, her tone as sharp as a blade. "You're not here for some heartfelt reunion. You're here because I demanded it." Lucia's eyes gleamed with a mixture of triumph and deep-seated resentment as she began to recount the harrowing journey that had led her to this moment. She told him how, after being handed over to the Jaguar, she had relied on her wits and sheer determination to navigate the treacherous world she had been thrust into. With each passing day, she had absorbed every nuance of the drug lord's empire, carefully studying the business, biding her time. Slowly but surely, she gained the Jaguar's trust until she had become his most trusted confidant, his right hand. "And you know what, Dad?" she continued, her voice laced with both pride and a seething undercurrent of anger. "I'm damn good at it. Better than you ever were at being a father." Ramon felt his soul withering under the weight of her words. Desperately, he tried to justify his actions, his voice weak and trembling. "Lucia, I was trapped. I had no choice. They would have killed us all if I didn't." Lucia's laugh cut him off, a harsh, mirthless sound that sent shivers down his spine. "There are always choices, Dad. But you," she paused, her gaze piercing through him like a spear. "You made the wrong one, and now you'll face the consequences." With a decisive snap of her fingers, two men appeared at the door of the office, their expressions as emotionless as the stone walls around them. "Take him away," Lucia commanded, her voice cold and unyielding. "From this moment on, he works for me. He has a debt to pay, a moral one." As the men grabbed Ramon and began to drag him out of the room, the realization hit him like a freight train. His daughter, whom he had betrayed so profoundly, had not only survived the hell he had cast her into, but had risen from the ashes stronger, more powerful. And now, she was his new master, his jailer. The bitter irony of it all twisted in his gut as he was hauled away, his mind reeling with the horrifying truth. Lucia's mind flashed back to that fateful day 2 months earlier when the sun had barely risen, casting weak rays of light on the bleak reality that awaited her. She had been thrown, terrified and tear-streaked, into the Jaguar's mansion. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood before the man who now owned her life, his predatory gaze stripping away whatever innocence she had left. "Welcome to your new life, sweetheart," the Jaguar had said, his smile as cold and unfeeling as the steel bars of a prison. The words chilled Lucia to the bone, echoing in her mind as the first days of her new reality unfolded like a never-ending nightmare. Those initial days were nothing short of hell. Humiliation, threats, and the constant shadow of fear became her daily existence. Yet, instead of breaking her, the relentless torment hardened Lucia's heart. She watched everything, learned quickly, and absorbed every detail of how the brutal organization operated. She transformed her fear into fuel, her pain into power. One day, while cleaning in the Jaguar's office, Lucia stumbled upon documents that revealed a mole within the organization. The discovery sparked something within her, a glimmer of hope, a chance to turn the tide in her favor. Without hesitation, she presented the evidence to the Jaguar, who, impressed by her audacity and keen insight, took her under his wing. "You've got guts, girl," he had said, a rare flicker of respect shining in his eyes. From that moment on, Lucia became the Jaguar's shadow, learning the intricacies of the business, mastering every lesson, and hoarding every secret like a weapon she would one day wield for her revenge. In the present, Lucia stood by a window, watching her father as he was forced to perform degrading tasks around the mansion. There was a part of her that felt a twisted satisfaction in seeing him suffer, in watching the man who had betrayed her now reduced to a mere servant. But buried deep within, there was another part, a quieter, more vulnerable part that mourned the loss of the girl she once was, the girl who had loved her father unconditionally. Enjoying the view, the jaguar's voice cut through her thoughts like a knife, pulling her back to the present. Lucia turned to face him, her expression carefully schooled into one of cold indifference. "Just making sure he's doing his job," she replied, her voice devoid of emotion. The jaguar's smile widened, his eyes glittering with a twisted satisfaction. "You know, I've always been curious about what might happen when a vengeful daughter meets the father who betrayed her. This is utterly fascinating," he mused, his voice dripping with malice. Lucia kept her expression neutral, but beneath the surface, her thoughts raced. The jaguar was playing a game, one far more dangerous than she had anticipated. She knew she couldn't afford to be just another piece in his sinister puzzle. Revenge would have to wait. Survival was now the priority. The jaguar's mansion buzzed with frenetic energy as servants hurried about, preparing for the grand event that evening. The luxurious space, usually steeped in an eerie silence, was now alive with the sounds of clinking glasses, hushed conversations, and the rustle of expensive fabrics. Ramon, now dressed in the uniform of a servant, watched the unfolding chaos with a bitter mix of awe and disgust. As he polished crystal goblets, his eyes remained fixed on Lucia. She moved through the mansion with the regal bearing of a queen, her presence commanding and authoritative as she issued orders and inspected every detail. To Ramon, it was as though a stranger had taken over the body of his little girl. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the mansion was filled with an array of high-ranking politicians, influential businessmen, and glittering entertainment figures. They mingled effortlessly, their voices blending into a symphony of insincere laughter and secretive whispers. Ramon, carrying a tray laden with champagne flutes, wove through the crowd, serving the guests while trying to make sense of the snippets of conversation that reached his ears. The shipment set for Tuesday, a man in an expensive suit murmured to his companion. "All paid for. No hitches," the other replied with a laugh. In the center of the room, the jaguar made his grand entrance, commanding the attention of everyone present. At his side, Lucia was a vision in a striking red dress, the color emphasizing her transformation. She looked older and more sophisticated, yet the sight of her in such a role caused Ramon's heart to ache. "My esteemed friends," the jaguar declared, his voice carrying through the hall with practiced ease, "allow me to introduce my protégée, Lucia, the future leader of our organization." The room erupted into applause, the sound echoing off the walls, as Ramon felt his heart shatter into countless pieces. The realization hit him with the force of a hammer. What had his little girl become? How had she been molded into this hardened, calculating figure standing proudly beside a man like the jaguar? Trying to keep his composure, Ramon approached a nearby group to offer them champagne, his mind still reeling. As he did, he overheard something that sent a chill down his spine. "The new route through Central America is going to triple our profits," the jaguar was saying with a smug grin. Ramon's eyes scanned the room, recognizing faces he had only ever seen on television: judges, senators, even a government minister. The scale of corruption and the sheer magnitude of the criminal enterprise he was now entangled in became horrifyingly clear. His gaze locked with Lucia's, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a flicker of the innocent girl she once was. But just as quickly, the mask of cold indifference slid back into place. As Lucia passed him, she leaned in close, her voice a barely audible whisper that dripped with icy warning. "Careful, Dad. One wrong move and the whole family pays." It was in that instant that Ramon fully understood the gravity of their situation. They were ensnared in a vast, malignant web of power and corruption, a labyrinth from which escape seemed impossible. The walls of the jaguar's mansion weren't just physical barriers, they were the very embodiment of the prison that now held them both captive, with Lucia's transformation and his betrayal tightening the chains that bound them. Detective Hernandez rubbed a weary hand over his haggard face, his bloodshot eyes fixated on the sprawling map of the city pinned to the wall, cluttered with notes, photos, and hastily drawn lines connecting the dots of his investigation. For months, he had been tirelessly following the trail of a series of mysterious disappearances, all linked to the shadowy operations of the Jaguars cartel. Now, at long last, he felt the elusive pieces of the puzzle beginning to align, bringing him closer to a breakthrough that had evaded him for so long. With renewed determination, he set out for the dilapidated streets of the old Suarez neighborhood. The narrow, crumbling alleys and the decaying facades told a story of poverty that had long since eroded any hope or joy from the lives of those who lived there. The air was thick with despair, and as Hernandez knocked on door after door, he was met with the same wary eyes and mumbled denials. "I don't know anything," they said. "I haven't seen anything." The responses were always the same, guarded and fearful, as if the residents were protecting themselves from something far worse than the law. Just as Hernandez was on the verge of giving up, feeling the weight of defeat settling in, an old woman's voice broke through the silence. From the cracked window of a weathered house, she called to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Officer," she beckoned, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and reluctant resolve. "I saw something the night they took the girl, Lucia." Hernandez's heart began to race as he listened intently to the old woman's account. She spoke of a black van and a man, impeccably dressed, who had taken the young woman. With each word, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Ramon Suarez, the missing father, was intricately tied to the Jaguar, the very man behind the cartel's reign of terror. Meanwhile, in the opulent yet oppressive confines of the Jaguar's mansion, a suffocating tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The drug lord, with a smile that was all surface and no substance, approached Lucia with a cold, calculating gleam in his eyes. "I have a task for you, my dear protégé," he said, his voice deceptively gentle, yet laced with a threat that was impossible to miss. "There's a traitor among us. I want you to take care of him." Lucia felt the ground shift beneath her feet, as if the very earth was conspiring to pull her under. This was her moment, a chance to solidify her place within the organization, to grasp real power. But it was also a moment fraught with peril, a step that once taken could never be undone. Ramon, who was nearby, mopping the floors with a vacant expression, overheard the exchange. His eyes met Lucia's, and in that brief, heart-stopping moment, a silent plea passed between them, his eyes filled with fear and guilt, hers with a mixture of uncertainty and sorrow. Both father and daughter realized they stood at a critical juncture. The choices they made in the coming moments would determine not only their own fates, but the fate of their entire family. The Jaguar watched the unfolding scene with a predator's keen interest, like a beast circling its prey, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. As night descended upon the Jaguar's mansion, the world outside was swallowed by shadows, mirroring the darkness that cloaked the lives within. Lucia, alone in the extravagant luxury of her room, stared at her reflection in the mirror. The face that looked back at her was both familiar and foreign. She no longer recognized the girl she once was. The Jaguar's words echoed endlessly in her mind: eliminate the traitor. The command was a death knell, ringing in her ears as she silently made her way through the mansion's corridors, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet underfoot. She found Ramon where she expected him to be, scrubbing the floors, lost in his own thoughts, a shadow of the man he used to be. For a brief moment, the cold mask that Lucia had worn for so long cracked, revealing the vulnerable, frightened girl beneath. "Dad," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost swallowed by the darkness. Ramon looked up, startled by the unexpected tenderness in her tone. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he saw a glimpse of the daughter he had once known and loved, the daughter who had been lost to him for so long. "I'm scared," Lucia admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them, a confession that felt both dangerous and necessary. They stood in silence, father and daughter, the weight of their shared history pressing down on them like a suffocating blanket. Finally, Lucia spoke, her voice heavy with the burden she carried. She told him of the Jaguar's order, of the doubts that plagued her, of how every day in this life she was losing a piece of herself. Ramon listened, his heart breaking anew with every word that left her lips. "My girl," he said at last, his voice trembling with sorrow, "this isn't what I wanted for you. I never wanted this." "And what did you want?" Dad, Lucia retorted, a spark of her old fire flickering in her eyes, though it was quickly dimmed by the cold reality of their situation. "Selling me wasn't part of the plan, was it?" Ramon lowered his head, the crushing weight of his guilt pressing him down. "I thought I was saving us all," he admitted, his voice filled with regret. "But I was a coward, a fool." Lucia battled with herself, torn between the desire to forgive him, to embrace the father she had once adored, and the hardened, vengeful part of her that screamed for justice, for retribution. Could she trust him? Could she trust anyone? "I can't refuse the Jaguar's order," she said finally, her voice steady but laced with despair. "If I do, it will be our death sentence." "There has to be another way," Ramon pleaded, desperation seeping into his words. Lucia's heart ached as she looked at him, the man who had once been her hero, now reduced to this a broken shell. She knew that whatever decision she made, there would be no going back. But in this moment, all she could do was hope that somewhere, somehow, a path forward would reveal itself, one that wouldn't lead them both to ruin. Before Lucia could muster a response, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway. In an instant, she snapped back into her cold, distant demeanor, her eyes hardening as she barked out an order. "Make sure that corner is spotless," she commanded harshly, just as one of the Jaguar's men came into view. Ramon, understanding the dangerous game his daughter was playing, nodded submissively and continued scrubbing the floor. Each movement was accompanied by a silent prayer, a desperate plea for a way out, for some miracle that could save them both from the nightmare they were ensnared in. Meanwhile, Detective Hernandez moved through the city like a phantom, gathering the last, grim pieces of a puzzle that had haunted him for months. His relentless pursuit of the truth led him to the modest Suarez home, where Elena, Ramon's wife, greeted him at the door. Her eyes were swollen and red from days of crying, her grief etched deep into her worn features. "Mrs. Suarez," Hernandez began gently, his voice soft yet insistent, "I need you to tell me everything you can remember about the night your daughter disappeared." With trembling hands, Elena recounted the strange and sudden changes in Ramon's behavior, the unexplained appearance of money, the dark cloud that seemed to settle over their home, and the terrifying night when Lucia vanished without a trace. "Something terrible happened that night," she wept, her voice breaking. "But Ramon never told me what. And now he's gone too." Back in the oppressive confines of the Jaguar's mansion, Lucia faced the most difficult challenge of her life. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the so-called traitor, a young accountant who had made the fatal mistake of questioning the cartel's financial dealings. The gun in her hand felt impossibly heavy, and her throat tightened with the knowledge of what she was expected to do. "I'm sorry," Lucia whispered, her voice barely audible as her hand trembled uncontrollably. But at the very last moment, something deep within her rebelled. She couldn't go through with it. The girl she once was, the humanity she still clung to, refused to pull the trigger. Instead, in a split-second decision, she devised a dangerous plan. She faked the execution, hid the terrified accountant, and fabricated convincing evidence of his death to present to the Jaguar. The drug lord, fooled by her calculated deception, was visibly impressed by what he perceived as Lucia's ruthless efficiency. His eyes gleamed with a twisted pride as he rewarded her with even greater responsibilities. "You've proven your loyalty," he said, his voice laced with both approval and a veiled threat. Ramon, who had witnessed the entire ordeal from the shadows, was gripped by a turbulent mix of horror and relief. He could see how Lucia was teetering on the edge, walking a perilous tightrope between survival and the complete annihilation of her soul. Later that night, in the deepest shadows of the mansion, father and daughter found each other. In the darkness, Lucia's icy facade melted away, leaving behind the frightened, conflicted woman she had become. "I couldn't do it," she confessed in a whisper, her voice trembling with fear and uncertainty. "But if the jaguar finds out?" Without hesitation, Ramon pulled his daughter into his arms, holding her close for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The embrace was filled with a desperate need for comfort, for reassurance, even as they both knew the enormity of the danger they faced. "We'll find a way out," Ramon promised, his voice thick with emotion. Yet deep down, he had no idea how to keep that promise, how to navigate the treacherous path that lay ahead. Unbeknownst to them, Detective Hernandez was drawing ever closer, his relentless investigation inching nearer to uncovering the truth, a truth that had the power to shatter the fragile balance Lucia and Ramon had managed to achieve in their living nightmare. As the walls began to close in, the stakes were higher than ever, with their very lives hanging in the balance. The jaguar paced his luxurious office, the sinister smile on his lips reflecting the cruelty that had long become second nature to him. His cold eyes fixated on Lucia, studying her with the calculated interest of a predator assessing its prey. "I have a new task for you, my dear," he murmured, his voice deceptively soft, yet dripping with menace. "It's time to take out the trash." Lucia's heart nearly stopped as the meaning of his words sunk in. There was no mistaking who the jaguar was referring to: Ramon, her father. Why him, she managed to ask, fighting to keep the tremor from her voice. The jaguar stepped closer, his presence suffocating. He reached out, his hand responsible for ordering so many deaths, gently caressing her cheek in a mockery of affection. "Because I want to see just how deep your loyalty runs, my little viper," he purred, his eyes glittering with sadistic pleasure. Lucia forced herself to nod, knowing that any hint of hesitation could seal her own fate. As soon as she left the oppressive atmosphere of the jaguar's office, panic gripped her. She rushed through the mansion's dimly lit corridors, desperate to find Ramon before it was too late. Her search led her to a lonely hallway where she spotted her father, hunched over, scrubbing the floors with a weariness that came not just from physical labor, but from the crushing burden of guilt and shame. "Dad," she whispered urgently, her eyes darting around to ensure they were alone. "You have to leave, now." Ramon looked up at her, confusion clouding his features. "What's going on?" "The jaguar has ordered me to kill you," Lucia confessed, the words searing her throat like acid. A flicker of horror crossed Ramon's face, but it was quickly replaced by a sorrowful resignation that shattered Lucia's heart. "Maybe it's what I deserve," he murmured, his voice heavy with the weight of his past mistakes. No, Lucia's voice rose, filled with a fierce intensity that surprised even her. "I've prepared a plan. Please, listen to me carefully." Meanwhile, in the depths of the mansion, Detective Hernandez had successfully infiltrated the estate under the guise of a maintenance worker. Moving with the practiced caution of a seasoned investigator, he meticulously gathered evidence, each piece another nail in the coffin for the jaguar's empire. In a darkened hallway, Hernandez witnessed the jaguar brutally assaulting one of his subordinates, a display of violence that turned his stomach, but also confirmed the depths of the cartel's depravity. The scene steeled his resolve. He now had what he needed to bring down the entire operation. As night fell, the mansion was engulfed in a darkness that seemed to extinguish any remaining hope. Lucia, her heart pounding in her chest, prepared to carry out the plan she had hastily devised to save her father. In a secluded room, Ramon sat alone, waiting for the end he feared was inevitable, his hands trembling as his mind swirled with a storm of regret and fear. Detective Hernandez, still undercover and moving like a shadow through the labyrinthine hallways, was readying himself for the moment to strike. His mind was set on dismantling the Jaguar's empire once and for all, but he knew the risks were enormous. Every step he took could lead to discovery and death. In the main hall, the Jaguar gathered his most trusted men, forming a circle of silent witnesses to the grim spectacle he had orchestrated. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, the air charged with the malevolent energy of what was about to unfold. From the shadows, the Jaguar observed everything, his eyes gleaming with malevolent intelligence, fully aware that this night was merely the beginning of a much larger, more dangerous game. As Lucia steeled herself for the task ahead, her thoughts raced. She knew the odds were against her, but she was determined to see her plan through. In that moment, surrounded by darkness and danger, she made a silent vow to herself, no matter the cost, she would not let her father die at her hands. The tension in the mansion was palpable as the clock ticked down. In one corner, Lucia fought to save her father. In another, Detective Hernandez prepared to deliver justice. And all the while, the Jaguar, with his predatory instincts, watched with the cold satisfaction of a man who believed he controlled every piece on the board. But as the night deepened, it became clear that the true battle was only just beginning, a battle for survival, for redemption, and for the soul of a daughter torn between loyalty and love. Lucia stepped into the room, her face a steely mask of determination that concealed the storm of emotions churning within her. Brigham commanded the Jaguar, his eyes gleaming with sadistic anticipation. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy as two thugs dragged Ramon into the center of the circle. Father and daughter locked eyes, a silent exchange that conveyed a depth of pain, love, and desperation that words could never fully capture. The Jaguar handed Lucia a gun, his smile widening with a cruel satisfaction. "Prove your loyalty, my dear," he drawled, the words dripping with venom. "Finish off the traitor." Lucia took the gun, her mind racing to find a way out of the impossible situation she was trapped in. She glanced at her father, then at the Jaguar, and finally down at the gun in her trembling hands. The world around her seemed to slow, every heartbeat pounding in her ears as time itself stretched at this critical moment. Suddenly, a deafening noise shattered the tension. The fire alarm blared throughout the mansion, the shrill sound piercing through the silence and plunging the room into chaos. Detective Hernandez, unable to wait any longer, had pulled the trigger on his plan, activating the alarm in a desperate bid to create a diversion. Pandemonium erupted. The Jaguar's men scrambled in confusion, shouting orders and searching for the source of the disruption. Seizing the moment, Lucia acted swiftly. Instead of pointing the gun at her father, she aimed it at the ceiling and fired, adding to the confusion. "We're under attack," she screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. The distraction was enough panic spread like wildfire among the Jaguar's men, some of whom began firing indiscriminately. Amid the uproar, Lucia grabbed Ramon by the arm and pulled him toward a hidden exit she had discovered during her time in the mansion. The Jaguar, his face twisted with rage, barked orders, trying to regain control as the situation spiraled out of his grasp. But Lucia and Ramon were already disappearing into the shadows, slipping through a dark passageway as the sounds of sirens grew louder in the distance. Detective Hernandez had managed to alert the authorities, and reinforcements were on their way. The escape had begun, but they were far from being out of danger. The Jaguar was not a man who forgave betrayal easily, and the night was still young. As they emerged from the secret passage into the chilly night air of the mansion's gardens, the stark reality of their situation hit them. The sounds of gunfire and shouting echoed from within the mansion, blending with the wail of approaching sirens. "This way," Lucia whispered urgently, leading her father through the sprawling gardens, her knowledge of the estate's layout guiding them through blind spots and hidden corners that she had meticulously memorized. Ramon, struggling to keep up, stumbled as fear and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. "Leave me," he gasped between ragged breaths. "Save yourself." Lucia whirled around, her eyes blazing with a mix of determination and defiance. "Don't you dare give up now, Dad, not after everything we've been through," she hissed, the fire in her voice driving him forward. A gunshot rang out nearby, forcing them to drop to the ground. Two of the Jaguar's men had spotted them and were closing in fast. Lucia's instincts kicked in, and she shoved Ramon behind the trunk of a large tree, shielding him from view. "Stop right there," one of the hitmen shouted. "The Jaguar wants you alive, but he didn't say anything about your father." In that moment, something snapped within Lucia. The months of fear, rage, and the constant facade she had been forced to maintain exploded in a surge of adrenaline and resolve. She wasn't just going to run, she was going to fight. Without hesitation, she stepped out from behind the tree, her mind clear and her movements swift, as she confronted the men with the same cold precision she had learned in the unforgiving world she had been thrust into. But before she could engage, her mind flashed back to the moment in the van, when Ramon had been brought to the mansion. The scene replayed itself vividly, the disorienting ride through the city's labyrinthine streets, the stifling silence inside the van broken only by the creak of leather and Ramon's labored breathing. The men beside him, impassive and cold, their eyes hidden behind dark glasses, had radiated menace. Ramon's thoughts had spiraled into darkness, imagining his own death, his body left to rot in a forgotten alley. He had thought of Elena, his wife, and how she would never know what had become of him or Lucia. The weight of regret had been suffocating, drowning him in a sea of what-ifs that threatened to tear his sanity apart. Then they had arrived at the mansion, a place far grander than Ramon had anticipated. The men had led him inside, their footsteps echoing ominously on the polished marble floors. What Ramon had seen there had taken his breath away, the walls adorned with gold-framed photographs of Lucia. But the Lucia in those images wasn't the daughter he remembered. This Lucia was elegant, poised, and exuded a powerful aura that both shocked and unsettled him. Her gaze in the photos was cold, determined, and she stood beside the Jaguar, smiling as if she belonged in the world he ruled. "What does this mean?" Ramon had murmured, his voice barely audible, overwhelmed by the realization of what his daughter had become. But there was no time to dwell on the past. The present was a maelstrom of survival, and Lucia was determined to protect the man who, despite everything, was still her father. In the face of the approaching threat, Lucia raised her gun, her hand steady as she locked eyes with the hitman. "Not one more step," she warned, her voice ice cold. The men hesitated, sensing the steel in her voice and the resolve in her stance. They were trained killers, but they also knew when someone meant business. "Do you really think the Jaguar will let you live if you cross me?" she challenged, her words slicing through the tension. The hitmen exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. It was all Lucia needed. In one swift motion, she fired a shot into the ground near their feet, forcing them to retreat. "Run, Dad," she yelled, grabbing Ramon and pulling him to his feet. Together they bolted through the gardens, the cover of darkness and the chaos within the mansion providing them the sliver of opportunity they needed to escape. As they reached the perimeter of the estate, the distant sound of sirens grew louder, a beacon of hope amidst the darkness. But Lucia knew better than to let her guard down. The Jaguar's reach was long, and the night was far from over. With Ramon by her side, Lucia led him through the final stretch, every instinct honed for survival. They weren't just running from the Jaguar, they were running toward the chance of a new beginning, however slim it might be. The cold night air bit at their skin, but it was nothing compared to the fire that burned within them, the fire to survive, to escape, and to reclaim their lives from the clutches of the darkness that had nearly consumed them. No one answered. They led him through long hallways until they reached a carved oak door. One of the men opened it, gently pushing Ramon inside. There, seated behind an imposing desk, was Lucia. Her gaze met her father's, and Ramon felt the world stop. "Hello, Dad," Lucia said, her voice cold as ice. "Welcome to my world." The silence in the luxurious office was so dense it could be cut with a knife. Ramon, with a dry mouth and a heart pounding in his chest, looked at his daughter as if she were an apparition. Lucia rose slowly, her designer suit highlighting a figure that was no longer that of the girl Ramon remembered. Her eyes, once warm and full of life, now reflected a hardness that sent a shiver down her father's spine. You've changed," Ramon managed to articulate, his voice barely a whisper. A cold smile played on Lucia's lips. People change when they're sold like cattle. Dad, every word was like a stab to Ramon's heart. He tried to approach her, but Lucia raised a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "You're not here for a family reunion," she said, her tone cutting. "You're here because I ordered it." Lucia began to recount how, after being handed over to the Jaguar, she had used her intelligence and cunning to survive. How she had learned every aspect of the business, slowly gaining the drug lord's trust until she became his right hand. "And you know what, Dad," she continued, her eyes shining with a mixture of triumph and resentment. "It turns out I'm good at this, better than you ever were at being a good father." Ramon, feeling each word sink him deeper, tried to justify himself. "Lucia, I had no choice. They would have killed us all." Lucia let out a humorless laugh. "There are always choices, Dad, and now you're going to face the consequences of yours." With a snap of her fingers, two men entered the office. "Take him away," Lucia ordered. "From today on, he works for me. He has a moral debt to pay." As they dragged him out of the office, Ramon realized with horror that his daughter had not only survived the hell he had condemned her to, but had become his new jailer. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Lucia was thrown into the Jaguar's mansion that fateful day, 2 months earlier. With her heart pounding and tears still fresh on her cheeks, she faced the predatory gaze of her new owner. "Welcome to your new life, sweetheart," the Jaguar said, his cold smile sending chills down Lucia's spine. The first days were hell. Humiliations, threats, and constant fear became a routine. But instead of breaking, Lucia hardened her heart. She watched, learned, absorbed every detail of how the organization operated. One day, while in the Jaguar's office, Lucia discovered documents revealing a traitor in the ranks. Without thinking twice, she brought the information to the drug lord. Impressed by her cunning, the Jaguar took her under his protection. "You've got guts, girl," he said, a spark of respect in his eyes. From that moment on, Lucia became the Jaguar's shadow, learning the ins and outs of the business. Every lesson, every secret, she kept as weapons for her future revenge. In the present, Lucia watched her father perform degrading tasks around the mansion. A part of her felt satisfaction at seeing him suffer, but another, buried deep inside, cried for the girl she once was. Enjoying the view, the Jaguar's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. Lucia turned, her face a mask of coldness. "Just making sure he's doing his job," she replied. The Jaguar smiled, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You know, I always wondered what would happen if I brought the vengeful daughter together with the traitor father. This is fascinating." Lucia maintained her composure, but inside her mind raced. The Jaguar was playing a dangerous game, and she couldn't afford to be just a pawn on his board. Revenge would have to wait. Survival was now her priority. The Jaguar's mansion buzzed with activity. Servants scurried back and forth, preparing everything for the grand party that night. Ramon, dressed in a servant's uniform, watched the chaos with a mix of awe and disgust. As he polished crystal glasses, his eyes never left Lucia. His daughter moved through the place with the grace of a queen, giving orders and supervising every detail. It was like watching a stranger with his little girl's face. As night fell, the mansion filled with high-ranking politicians, powerful businessmen, and entertainment figures, mingling in a symphony of fake laughter and whispered conversations. Rahman, tray in hand, slid among the guests, serving champagne. His ears caught snippets of conversations that made his blood run cold. The shipment arrives on Tuesday. He heard a man in an expensive suit say, "It's paid for. No problems," another responded, laughing. In the center of the room, the Jaguar made his grand entrance. At his side, Lucia shone in a red dress that made her look older than she was. "My friends," the Jaguar announced, his voice resonating in the hall, "I present to you my protégée Lucia, the future of our organization." Applause filled the air as Rahman felt his heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. What has my little girl become, he wondered, trying to keep his composure. Rahman approached a nearby group to serve champagne when he overheard something that left him frozen. "With the new route through Central America, we'll triple our profits," the Jaguar was saying. Rahman looked around, recognizing faces he had seen on television: judges, senators, even a minister. The magnitude of the corruption hit him like a slap. His eyes met Lucia's. For a moment he thought he saw a glimpse of the girl she once was, but the mask of coldness quickly returned to her face. "Careful, Dad," Lucia whispered as she passed him. "One wrong move and the whole family pays." Rahman then understood that they were trapped in a web of power and evil from which they might never escape. Detective Hernandez ran a hand over his tired face, his bloodshot eyes fixed on the city map covered with notes and photographs. He had spent months tracking a series of disappearances linked to the Jaguar's cartel and finally felt he was close to a solid lead. Determined, he headed to the old Suarez neighborhood. The narrow streets and dilapidated houses told a story of poverty and despair. He knocked on door after door, but was met with evasive glances and vague responses. "I don't know anything. I haven't seen anything," were the phrases repeated over and over again. Just as he was about to give up, an old woman called him from her window. "Officer," she whispered, "I saw something the night they took the girl, Lucia." With his heart racing, Hernandez listened to the old woman's account of the black van and the well-dressed man who took the young woman. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Ramon Suarez, the missing father, was connected to the Jaguar. Meanwhile, in the Jaguar's mansion, the tension was palpable. The drug lord, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, approached Lucia. "I have a task for you, my dear protégée," he said, his voice soft but laden with threat. "There's a traitor among us. I want you to take care of him." Lucia felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This was her chance to gain real power in the organization, but it also meant crossing a line from which there would be no return. Rahman, who was cleaning nearby, overheard the conversation. His eyes met his daughter's, a look filled with fear, guilt, and a silent plea. In that moment, father and daughter realized they were at a crossroads. The decision Lucia made would not only define her future, but the fate of their entire family. The Jaguar observed the scene with interest, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Night fell over the Jaguar's mansion, wrapping everything in shadows that seemed to dance with the secrets and lies that inhabited the place. Lucia, alone in her luxurious room, stared at herself in the mirror, not recognizing the person she saw. The Jaguar's order echoed in her mind like an endless echo: eliminate the traitor with silent steps. She slipped through the hallways until she found Rahman, who was scrubbing the floors with a distant look in his eyes. For a moment, Lucia's cold mask cracked. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Rahman looked up, surprised by his daughter's vulnerable tone. For the first time in months, he saw a glimpse of the girl she once was. "I'm scared," Lucia confessed. the words escaping her lips before she could stop them. Father and daughter looked at each other, the silence between them heavy with unspoken emotions. Finally, Lucia spoke of the Jaguar's order, her doubts, and how every day she felt like she was losing a part of herself. Ramon listened, his heart breaking with each word. "My girl," he said at last, his voice cracking, "this isn't what I wanted for you. I never wanted this." "And what did you want?" Dad, Lucia responded, a spark of her old fire in her eyes. "Selling me wasn't part of the plan." Ramon lowered his head, guilt weighing on him like a slab. "I thought I was saving all of us. I was a coward, a fool." Lucia struggled internally. A part of her wanted to embrace her father, forgive him, escape together from this nightmare. Another part, hardened by pain and betrayal, screamed at her not to trust, to continue with her plan for revenge. "I can't refuse the Jaguar's order," she said finally. "It would be our death sentence." "There must be another way," Ramon pleaded. Before Lucia could respond, footsteps approached down the hallway. She quickly resumed her cold and distant posture. "Make sure that corner is clean," she ordered harshly, just as one of the Jaguar's men rounded the corner. Ramon nodded, understanding the dangerous game his daughter was playing. As he scrubbed, he prayed silently for a way out, for a chance at redemption for both of them. Detective Hernandez moved through the city streets like a shadow, gathering pieces of a macabre puzzle. His steps led him to the Mata Suarez home, where Elena, Ramon's wife, greeted him with eyes red from crying. "Mrs. Suarez," Hernandez began softly, "I need you to tell me everything you remember about the night your daughter disappeared." With trembling hands, Elena recounted how Ramon had suddenly changed, how money appeared out of nowhere, and how Lucia vanished without a trace. "Something terrible happened that night," she sobbed, "but Ramon never told me, and now he's gone too." Meanwhile, in the Jaguar's mansion, Lucia faced her toughest test yet. With a lump in her throat, she approached the supposed traitor, a young accountant who had made the mistake of questioning the cartel's accounts. "I'm sorry," Lucia whispered, her hand trembling as she held the gun. But at the last second, something in her rebelled. She couldn't pull the trigger. Instead, she devised a risky plan. She faked the execution, hid the accountant, and presented false evidence of his death to the Jaguar. The drug lord, impressed by Lucia's apparent coldness, rewarded her with more responsibilities. "You've proven your loyalty," he said, his eyes gleaming with a mix of pride and threat. Ramon, a silent witness to his daughter's transformation, felt a mix of horror and relief. He saw how Lucia walked the thin line between survival and the total loss of her humanity. That night, father and daughter met in a dark corner of the mansion. "I couldn't do it," Lucia confessed in a whisper. "But if the Jaguar finds out..." Ramon, for the first time in months, embraced his daughter. "We'll find a way out," he promised, though he didn't know how to fulfill that promise. Unbeknownst to both, Detective Hernandez was getting closer to discovering the truth, a truth that threatened to destroy the fragile balance Lucia and Ramon had achieved in their personal hell. The Jaguar paced his office, a cruel smile playing on his lips. His eyes fell on Lucia, evaluating her. "I have a new task for you, my dear," he said, his voice soft but loaded with menace. "It's time to get rid of the trash." Lucia's heart stopped for an instant. She knew who the Jaguar was referring to: Ramon, her father. "Why him?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. The Jaguar approached, caressing her cheek with a hand that had ordered countless deaths. "Because I want to see how far your loyalty goes, my little viper." Lucia nodded, aware that any doubt could cost her life. As soon as she left the office, she frantically searched for Ramon. She found him cleaning the hallways, his figure bent under the weight of guilt and forced labor. "Dad," she whispered, glancing around to make sure they were alone, "you have to leave now." Ramon looked at her, confused. "What's going on?" "The Jaguar has ordered me to kill you," Lucia said, the words burning her throat. Horror reflected in Ramon's eyes, quickly followed by a resignation that broke Lucia's heart. "Maybe it's what I deserve," Ramon murmured. "No," Lucia exclaimed, surprised by the ferocity in her own voice. "I've prepared a plan. Listen carefully." Meanwhile, Detective Hernandez had managed to infiltrate the mansion as maintenance staff. Moving cautiously, he gathered evidence that could dismantle the Jaguar's empire. In a dark hallway, Hernandez witnessed the Jaguar brutalizing one of his subordinates. The scene turned his stomach, but it also provided the evidence he needed. That night, as Lucia set her risky plan in motion to save Ramon and Hernandez prepared to strike the final blow to the cartel, the Jaguar watched everything from the shadows, his eyes gleaming with malevolent intelligence, foreshadowing that the real test was just beginning. Night fell over the Jaguar's mansion, a mantle of darkness that seemed to swallow all hope. Lucia, with her heart racing, prepared to carry out the final task the Jaguar had imposed on her. In a secluded room, Ramon awaited his fate, his hands trembling and his mind a whirlwind of regret and fear. Detective Hernandez, still undercover, moved silently through the hallways, preparing to intervene. The Jaguar gathered his closest men in the main hall, creating a circle of witnesses for the macabre spectacle about to begin. Lucia entered, her face a mask of determination hiding the turmoil within. "Bring him," ordered the Jaguar, his eyes gleaming with a mix of cruelty and anticipation. Two thugs dragged Ramon into the center of the circle. Father and daughter locked eyes, communicating a world of pain, love, and despair that words could never express. The Jaguar handed Lucia a gun. "Prove your loyalty, my dear. Finish off the traitor." Lucia took the gun, her mind racing to find a way out. She looked at her father, then at the Jaguar, and finally at the gun in her hands. Time seemed to freeze at that critical moment. A loud noise suddenly erupted. Detective Hernandez, unable to hold back any longer, had activated the fire alarm. Chaos erupted in the mansion. Taking advantage of the confusion, Lucia acted quickly. Instead of shooting Ramon, she turned and fired into the air, creating even more panic. "We're under attack," she shouted, sowing confusion among the Jaguar's men. Amid the chaos, Lucia grabbed her father and dragged him toward a secret exit she had discovered during her months in the mansion. The Jaguar, furious, shouted orders amid the pandemonium. As they ran through a dark passage, Lucia and Ramon heard sirens in the distance. Detective Hernandez had managed to contact reinforcements. The escape had begun, but they were far from safe. The Jaguar was not someone who forgave betrayal, and the night was still young. The cold night air hit Lucia and Ramon as they emerged from the secret passage into the mansion's gardens. The sirens were getting closer, mixing with the shouts and gunfire coming from inside. "This way," Lucia whispered, guiding her father toward the back of the property. Years of captivity had taught her every corner, every blind spot of the security cameras. Ramon, panting from the effort and fear, stumbled. "Leave me," he said between ragged breaths. "Save yourself." Lucia stopped, her eyes shining with a mix of determination and fury. "Don't you dare give up now, Dad, not after all this." A nearby gunshot made them crouch down. Two of the Jaguar's men had seen them and were approaching quickly. Acting on instinct, Lucia pushed Ramon behind a tree and faced the hitmen. "Stop," shouted one of them. "The Jaguar wants you alive, but he didn't say anything about your father." At that moment, something in Lucia snapped. All the months of fear, pent-up rage, and pretending to be someone she wasn't exploded in an instant of pure adrenaline, with a speed and precision that 4-0. "You said, Teep Took." ChatGPT said. ChatGPT. Surprised even herself, Lucia disarmed the first man and used his weapon to neutralize the second. Rahman watched in shock, seeing in his daughter not the girl he had sold but a woman forged in the fire of the hell he had created. "Let's go," Lucia said, her voice tinged with a new hardness. "We don't have much time." As they ran toward freedom, Detective Hernandez led the assault on the mansion. The Jaguar, cornered, roared orders to his men, his empire crumbling around him. Lucia and Rahman reached the edge of the property, but they knew the real battle was just beginning. The Jaguar was not someone who forgave betrayal, and his reach extended far beyond the walls of his mansion. As they ventured into the night, father and daughter shared a look. In their eyes was a silent promise they would survive together, or they wouldn't survive at all. Dawn found Lucia and Rahman hiding in a roadside motel on the outskirts of the city. The room, with its faded wallpaper and the constant hum of an old fan, was a world away from the luxury Lucia had grown accustomed to in the Jaguar's mansion. Rahman, sitting on the edge of the bed, looked at his daughter with a mixture of admiration and guilt. Lucia, for her part, moved restlessly around the room, her mind racing with thoughts of their next move. "We have to leave soon," Lucia said, her voice filled with urgency. "The Jaguar has eyes everywhere." Rahman nodded slowly. "Lucia, I'm so sorry. All of this is my fault." Lucia stopped and faced her father. In her eyes, a storm of emotions swirled: anger, pain, but also a glimmer of something else: hope. "Yes, it is," she replied harshly, "but now isn't the time for apologies. We have to survive." As they discussed their next step, the motel's television broadcasted the local news. Suddenly, the Jaguar's image filled the screen. The drug lord, impeccably dressed, was holding a press conference. "I am a victim of a conspiracy," he declared with false indignation. "These accusations are baseless and the result of a personal vendetta." Lucia and Rahman watched in disbelief as the Jaguar portrayed himself as a respectable businessman, denying any connection to organized crime. "Damn bastard," Lucia muttered. "He's using his connections to get away with it." At that moment, there was a knock at the door. Father and daughter froze, exchanging panicked glances. Lucia silently grabbed the gun she had taken, while Rahman cautiously approached the door. "Who is it?" he asked, his voice trembling. Detective Hernandez responded, a familiar voice. "You're in danger. We need to move now." Lucia and Rahman exchanged a look, aware that they were about to make a decision that could change their lives forever, trusting Hernandez could be their salvation or their downfall. The silence in Detective Hernandez's car was tense, broken only by the soft hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Lucia, sitting in the back seat next to her father, kept a hand close to the gun hidden in her jacket, her eyes constantly scanning the streets they passed. Hernandez glanced at them through the rear-view mirror. "I have a safe place where you can stay for now," he said, his voice weary but firm. "But I need you to tell me everything, every detail." Rahman began to speak, his voice breaking as he recounted how he had sold Lucia to the Jaguar. Lucia, for her part, described with cold precision the internal workings of the cartel: names, dates, places of operation. Suddenly, Hernandez braked sharply. "They're following us," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the rear-view mirror. A black SUV was approaching rapidly, its tinted windows concealing its occupants. Hernandez accelerated, zigzagging through the morning traffic. Lucia clung to her seat, her heart pounding. "Watch out," Rahman shouted as another vehicle appeared, blocking their path. Hernandez swerved into a side street, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The SUV followed closely, getting closer with each turn. "I have to get you out of here," Hernandez growled, taking a series of sharp turns to try and lose their pursuers, Lucia, acting on instinct, pulled out her gun. "Let me help," she said, her voice cold and determined. No, Hernandez and Ramon shouted in unison, but it was too late. Lucia rolled down the window and fired at the SUV's tires. The vehicle lost control and crashed into a lamppost. Hernandez took advantage of the confusion to accelerate, disappearing into the labyrinth of city streets. Minutes later, when they finally stopped in a dark alley, they were all breathing heavily. Hernandez looked at Lucia with a mix of awe and concern. "That was impressive and extremely dangerous," he said. Lucia holstered her weapon, her eyes meeting her father's in the mirror. In that shared look, both understood that their journey of redemption was just beginning, and that the road ahead would be filled with dangers neither could imagine. The refuge Hernandez had prepared was a small apartment in a dilapidated building on the outskirts of the city. The detective led them up creaky stairs to a rusty door. "It's not much," Hernandez said as he opened the door, "but it's safe for now." Lucia entered first, her eyes scanning every corner of the place, unconsciously looking for escape routes. Ramon followed, his face a mask of exhaustion and guilt. Hernandez closed the door and activated several locks. "I need you to give me all the information you have on the Jaguar names, places, dates, everything," Hernandez said. Lucia nodded, her mind already working on how to use this situation to her advantage. "I'll tell you everything I know, detective, but I need guarantees." "Guarantees?" Hernandez asked, raising an eyebrow. "Immunity," Lucia responded without hesitation, "for me and for my father." Ramon looked at her, surprised. "Daughter, I have to pay for what I did." "No," Lucia interrupted, her voice firm. "We've paid enough." Hernandez observed them in silence for a moment. "I'll see what I can do, but first I need that information." For the next few hours, Lucia detailed the secrets of the Jaguar's empire, names of corrupt politicians, trafficking routes, hidden bank accounts. Every word was a stab to the heart of the organization that had held her captive. Ramon listened in silence, horrified by the world he had plunged his daughter into. Suddenly, the sound of sirens filled the air. Hernandez peeked out the window, his face paling. "They found us," he murmured. Lucia jumped to her feet, her body tense like a spring. "How?" "I don't know," Hernandez replied, drawing his weapon, "but we have to leave now." As they prepared to flee again, Lucia and Ramon shared a look. In their eyes was a mixture of fear and determination. They knew this could be their last chance to escape, to redeem themselves, to start anew. With the sound of sirens getting closer, father and daughter braced themselves to face whatever came, aware that the real danger was just beginning. Chaos erupted in the streets as Lucia, Ramon, and Detective Hernandez fled the building. The sirens wailed, mingling with the sound of screeching tires and shouts of confusion. Hernandez led them through narrow alleys, avoiding the main roads where the Jaguar's men and corrupt police officers were searching for them. "This way," panted Hernandez, pointing to a back door of an old warehouse. They had barely entered when the sound of gunfire echoed in the distance. Lucia tensed, her survival instincts on high alert. "We have to split up," she said, her voice cold and calculated. "We're an easy target together." Ramon looked at her in horror. "No, Lucia, I won't leave you again." "Your daughter's right," Hernandez intervened. "I have a contact at the port who can get you out of the city." Lucia nodded, her mind already making plans. "I'll go first, clear the way." Before Ramon could protest, Lucia slipped through a broken window, disappearing into the night. Hernandez and Ramon waited in silence, each minute feeling like an eternity. Suddenly, Hernandez's walkie-talkie crackled to life. "Detective," a voice crackled, "we have you surrounded. Surrender." "It's a trap," murmured Hernandez. "Someone sold us out." At that moment, the warehouse door burst open. Armed men entered, their weapons aimed at Ramon and Hernandez. "Well," said a familiar voice. The Jaguar entered, his predatory smile illuminated by the light of the flashlights. "It seems the family is reunited." "Well, almost." Ramon felt his heart stop. "Where's Lucia?" he shouted. The Jaguar laughed. "Oh, my dear protégé, so intelligent, so brave. It's a shame she chose the wrong side." Two of his men dragged Lucia into the room. Her face was bruised, but her eyes burned with indomitable fury. "I'm sorry, Dad," Lucia murmured, before a blow silenced her. Ramon screamed in rage, struggling against the men who held him. Hernandez, taking advantage of the confusion, managed to draw his weapon. The warehouse turned into a battlefield, with everyone's fate hanging by a thread. Chaos reigned in the warehouse. Gunfire, shouts, and the sound of bodies crashing against metal filled the air. In the midst of the confusion, Ramon managed to free himself and ran toward Lucia, his paternal instinct overcoming his fear. Lucia, still dazed from the blow, struggled to stand. Her eyes met her father's, a spark of hope igniting in the midst of the chaos. Hernandez, meanwhile, faced off against the Jaguar. Despite his training, the detective was overwhelmed by the drug lord's brutality. "You should have stayed at your desk," Cop the Jaguar taunted, cornering Hernandez against a wall. Suddenly, the sound of sirens filled the air. Police reinforcements were approaching. The Jaguar cursed, realizing his advantage was slipping away. "We're leaving," he ordered his men. In the confusion of the retreat, Lucia saw her opportunity. With a quick movement, she grabbed a fallen weapon and aimed it at the Jaguar. "This is for everything you put me through," she murmured, her finger on the trigger. But before she could shoot, Ramon stopped her. "No, daughter, don't become what he wanted you to be." The Jaguar took advantage of the moment to escape, disappearing into the night along with his men. Seconds later, the police stormed the warehouse. Hernandez, injured but alive, quickly identified himself. "They're under my protection," he said, pointing to Lucia and Ramon, their key witnesses. As the paramedics tended to the wounded, Lucia and Ramon embraced, silent tears streaming down their cheeks. "I'm so sorry," Dad, Lucia whispered, "for everything." Ramon hugged her tighter. "No, my girl, I'm the one who should be apologizing. But I promise that from now on, I'll do everything I can to protect you." Hernandez approached them, his face a mix of relief and concern. "We're not safe yet. The Jaguar is still out there, and he won't rest until he silences you." Lucia nodded, her determination renewed. "Then we'll have to be smarter than him." As they left the warehouse into an uncertain future, the three of them knew the real battle was just beginning. The dawn found Lucia, Ramon, and Hernandez in a safe house on the outskirts of the city. The detective, with deep circles under his eyes and unyielding determination, spread a map across the kitchen table. "The Jaguar has activated all his contacts," Hernandez explained, pointing to several spots on the map. "He has eyes and ears in the police, the government, even the media." Lucia, holding a cold cup of coffee in her hands, nodded. "He won't stop until he eliminates us. We're the only real threat to his empire." Ramon, sitting in a corner, watched his daughter with a mix of pride and fear. "What can we do? We're just three against an army." "We have something they don't," Lucia replied, her eyes shining with determination. "Inside knowledge. I know how the Jaguar thinks. I know his weaknesses." Hernandez looked at her with curiosity. "What do you propose?" "A trap," Lucia said, leaning over the map. "We'll use his paranoia against him." As they discussed the plan, The television in the corner of the room broadcasted the local news. Suddenly, the Jaguar's face appeared on the screen. "I am a victim of a conspiracy," he declared with false indignation. "I demand that my rights be respected." Lucia turned off the TV with a sharp, decisive gesture, her eyes narrowing as she watched the last image fade from the screen. "He's playing his respectable businessman card again. We need to act fast." The urgency in her voice was clear, and the plan that had been meticulously crafted was quickly set in motion. Detective Hernandez, leveraging his extensive network of contacts, began spreading false information about a supposed betrayal within the Jaguar's organization. Lucia, with her intimate knowledge of the cartel's inner workings, skillfully helped construct a plausible scenario that would plant seeds of doubt in the Jaguar's mind. The goal was to make him question the loyalty of those closest to him, to make him vulnerable and more likely to fall into the trap they were setting. Meanwhile, Ramon, driven by a deep need to atone for his past mistakes, stepped forward with an offer that made Lucia's heart skip a beat. "Let me be the bait," he proposed, his voice steady despite the fear he must have felt. "No," Lucia said firmly, shaking her head. "It's too dangerous, Dad. I can't let you do that." Ramon met her gaze with a look of quiet resolve, a determination that reminded her of the man he had been before desperation and guilt had driven him down a dark path. "This is my chance to make things right," he insisted, his voice tinged with a sense of purpose. "I need to help, Lucia. Let me do this." Lucia studied her father for a long moment, seeing in him the strength and courage that had once defined him. It was a side of him she hadn't seen in years, and it stirred something deep within her. Finally, with a reluctant nod, she agreed. "Okay, but on one condition: we do this together." Hernandez observed their exchange, fully aware of the gravity of the situation. They were about to walk into the lion's den, and the Jaguar was no ordinary foe. He was a cunning, ruthless predator, and one misstep could cost them everything. As night descended over the city, wrapping it in a shroud of uncertainty, Lucia and Ramon stood side by side in an old, abandoned warehouse at the port, the location carefully chosen for the final showdown. The warehouse, once bustling with activity, now stood eerily silent, its decay mirroring the danger that loomed over them. Hernandez and a team of trusted agents were hidden in the shadows, their weapons ready, waiting for the signal to strike. Lucia, dressed in a sleek outfit that radiated the elegance and poise she had learned during her time under the Jaguar's tutelage, paced back and forth, her nerves fraying with each passing second. Ramon, standing close by, fought to steady his breathing, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a heavy shroud. "Remember the plan," Lucia whispered, her voice barely audible. "When he arrives, let me do the talking." Ramon nodded, his expression a mixture of determination and underlying fear. "I trust you, daughter," he replied, his voice tinged with both love and apprehension. The sound of tires crunching on gravel suddenly pierced the tense silence. The faint glow of headlights swept through the warehouse, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls as three sleek, black vehicles pulled up at the entrance. The central car's door opened, and the Jaguar emerged, his presence commanding and terrifying. His immaculate suit contrasted sharply with the derelict surroundings, and his cold, calculating gaze immediately locked onto Lucia and Ramon. "My dear protégé," he greeted, his voice dripping with false warmth, a smile curving his lips that never reached his eyes. "And the traitor father, how touching." Lucia stepped forward, forcing herself to project an air of confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Let's end this, Jaguar," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the fear gnawing at her insides. "You know why we're here." The Jaguar laughed, a dark, sinister sound that sent a shiver down Ramon's spine. "You think you can negotiate with me after what you've done?" he sneered, his eyes glinting with malice. Lucia met his gaze head-on, refusing to back down. "I have information," she declared, her voice firm, unwavering. "Information that could either destroy you or save you. The choice is yours." The jaguar's smile faded slightly, his eyes narrowing as he assessed her words. He was no fool. He knew the power of information, the delicate balance it could tip in any direction. But he was also a man who thrived on control, on dominance, and he wasn't about to let a challenge to his authority go unanswered. "Do you really think you can outsmart me, Lucia?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous. "I made you who you are. I know every move you'll make before you even think of it." Lucia's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "You taught me well, Jaguar," she said, a hint of defiance in her tone. "But even you can't predict everything." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with the weight of the moment. Ramon stood by, silent, knowing that this was Lucia's battle to fight, yet ready to step in if the need arose. Finally, the jaguar spoke, his voice cold and calculating. "Very well," he said. "Show me what you have. But be warned, Lucia, if this is a trick, you and your father won't live to regret it." Lucia nodded, understanding the stakes. She took a deep breath, knowing that this was the moment that would decide everything: their lives, their future, and the end of the jaguar's reign. She was ready to lay it all on the line, to fight for her father, for herself, and for the chance to finally break free from the darkness that had held them captive for so long. For a fleeting moment, doubt flickered across the jaguar's face, a crack in his usually impenetrable demeanor. It was the opening they had been waiting for. But in the next heartbeat, everything spiraled into chaos. One of the jaguar's men, on edge and panicked, fired a shot into the air. The sharp crack of the gunshot shattered the tense silence, and the warehouse erupted into pandemonium. Hernandez and his team burst from their hiding places, their voices ringing out as they shouted orders. The jaguar, realizing too late that he had walked into a trap, pulled his own weapon, his eyes locking onto Lucia with murderous intent. Before Lucia could react, Ramon's protective instincts took over. Without a second thought, he lunged in front of his daughter, just as the jaguar squeezed the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the warehouse, cutting through the chaos like a knife. Ramon crumpled to the ground, a crimson stain rapidly spreading across his shirt. "Dad!" Lucia's scream pierced the din, her voice raw with anguish as she dropped to her knees beside him. In the middle of the frenzied crossfire, father and daughter shared a moment that seemed to transcend the surrounding violence. Their eyes met, and in that gaze, a lifetime of regret, love, and unspoken words passed between them. Ramon's sacrifice, born of a desire to protect and redeem, hung in the air like a solemn vow. Gunfire and shouts reverberated through the warehouse as Lucia desperately tried to staunch the flow of blood from her father's wound. Her hands, slick with blood, pressed against his chest, but the crimson liquid seeped through her fingers. "Don't you dare leave me, Dad!" Lucia pleaded, her voice trembling as tears mingled with the blood on her hands. "Not now, not like this." Ramon's eyes softened, filled with a deep, abiding love that had been buried beneath years of pain and guilt. "My girl," he whispered, his voice weak but full of emotion, "I'm so sorry for everything." Around them, the battle raged on. Hernandez and his team fought fiercely against the jaguar's men, the cacophony of gunfire almost overwhelming. The jaguar, seeing his empire disintegrating before his eyes, made a desperate bid for escape. Lucia, through her tears, saw him moving toward the exit. In that instant, something inside her snapped into focus. She couldn't let him get away, not after everything he had taken from them. "Hold on, Dad," Lucia whispered, her voice choked with emotion as she leaned down to kiss Ramon's forehead. Then, with a resolve forged in the fires of her suffering, she stood, her grief transforming into cold determination. She spotted a gun lying on the ground, abandoned in the chaos. Grabbing it, Lucia sprinted after the jaguar, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and fury. She caught up to him just as he was about to slide into his car, his escape within reach. "It's over," Lucia called out, her voice steady as she aimed the gun at him. The jaguar turned to face her, his expression a volatile mix of rage and desperation. "It never ends, my dear," he spat, his voice venomous. "There will always be someone like me." Lucia's grip on the gun tightened, her resolve unshakable. "Maybe," she replied, her tone as cold and unyielding as steel, "but you won't be here to see it." A final gunshot rang out, the sound echoing through the night like the closing chapter of a long and painful story. The bullet found its mark, and the jaguar crumpled to the ground, lifeless. The echoes of the shot lingered in the stillness that followed, as if the night itself were absorbing the weight of what had just transpired. Moments later, Detective Hernandez reached Lucia's side, his eyes wide with the realization of what she had done. He took in the sight of the jaguar's lifeless body at her feet, and then his gaze shifted to Lucia, who stood motionless, the gun slipping from her grasp to the ground with a dull thud. "It's done," Lucia whispered, her voice a weary blend of exhaustion and finality. Hernandez nodded, understanding the profound weight of her words. The nightmare that had consumed so much of their lives was finally over, but he also knew that the battle for Lucia and Ramon was far from finished. As they turned to make their way back to the warehouse, the weight of the night's events hung heavy in the air, but for the first time in a long time, there was also a glimmer of hope that the darkness they had endured was beginning to give way to a brighter, if uncertain, dawn. Hernandez nodded, the weight of what had transpired settling heavily on his shoulders. Together they hurried back to the warehouse, where paramedics were already tending to Ramon, his body battered but alive. "He's going to survive," one of the paramedics assured them, "but we need to get him to the hospital immediately." As they carefully loaded Ramon into the waiting ambulance, Lucia reached out and took his hand, her grip firm yet tender. "We did it, Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and disbelief. "It's over." Ramon managed a weak smile, his eyes brimming with pride. "I'm proud of you, daughter," he rasped. "I always have been." Lucia climbed into the ambulance, refusing to let go of her father's hand as they drove away from the scene that had witnessed the end of their nightmare and the tentative beginning of a new life. Hernandez stood outside, watching the ambulance pull away, fully aware that while the immediate danger had passed, the real struggle for Lucia and Ramon was only just beginning. The battle for redemption, for healing, and for reclaiming the lives they had nearly lost. 6 months later, Lucia found herself standing by the window of Ramon's hospital room, watching the first light of dawn spread across the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. The serene beauty of the sunrise seemed to mirror the quiet peace that had finally settled in her heart. Her father slept soundly in the bed behind her, his breathing steady and even a stark contrast to the tumultuous events of that fateful night. Ramon's recovery had been long and arduous, each day a grueling struggle, but with each passing moment there were small victories that brought them both closer to a semblance of normalcy. Lucia had remained steadfast by his side, facing her own demons as she helped her father battle his. A soft knock on the door broke her reverie. Turning, Lucia saw Detective Hernandez enter the room, his demeanor calm and reassuring as always. "I have some news," he said quietly, careful not to disturb Ramon's sleep. Lucia followed him into the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest, bracing herself for whatever he might say. "The judge has accepted the deal," Hernandez informed her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Your testimony was instrumental in taking down the remnants of the Jaguar's empire. In return, you'll be granted full immunity." Lucia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, the tension slowly releasing from her body. "And my father?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hernandez's smile widened just slightly, a glimmer of warmth in his usually stoic eyes. Given his role and the condition he's in, he'll receive a suspended sentence. He'll need to do some community service, but he won't be going to prison. The tears Lucia had been holding back for so long finally spilled over, streaming down her cheeks in a torrent of mixed emotions: relief, gratitude, and the first stirrings of healing. They returned to the room just as Rahman began to stir, his eyes fluttering open. The sight of tears on his daughter's face immediately filled him with concern. "What's wrong?" he croaked, his voice still hoarse from sleep. Lucia hurried to his side, taking his hand in hers. "It's over, Dad," she reassured him, her voice thick with emotion. "It's really over." As Hernandez explained the details of the judge's decision, Lucia gazed out the window, watching as the sun rose higher, casting the city in a golden light that seemed to promise a new beginning, a future full of hope. "What will we do now?" Rahman asked once Hernandez had left, his voice tinged with both uncertainty and a longing for the peace they had so desperately sought. Lucia turned back to him, a genuine smile lighting up her face, a smile that had been absent for far too long. "We'll live, Dad," she said softly, the words filled with a quiet determination. "We'll simply live." She sat down beside his bed, still holding his hand as they both allowed the weight of the past to begin lifting, replaced by the possibilities of the future. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were wounds that would take time to heal, and the trust that had been shattered would need to be carefully rebuilt. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they had something they hadn't dared to hope for: a second chance. As the day wore on, father and daughter sat in a comfortable silence, each lost in thought as they contemplated the future that now lay before them. It would be a future marked by scars, but also by resilience, by the strength they had found in each other, and by a renewed love that would guide them as they navigated the challenges ahead. The road to redemption and healing would be long, but it was a journey they were ready to embark on together. As we reflect on this intense journey, what have you learned so far? Life often presents us with impossible choices, but it's in how we respond that our true character is revealed. I invite you to share in the comments below one thing you've learned from this story that you will bring into practice in your own life. If you like this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support helps us continue to bring you powerful stories like this one.